Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our strategic planning webinar series, this one focusing on our theory of change. I'm Kathleen Ratcliff with Upstream Prevention, putting this together for you Missouri campuses that are a part of the Missouri Partners in Prevention. So this is, like I mentioned, our second in our webinar series. Our first one, we talked about Prevention 101 and set some of that kind of base level information. And so this second one, we're focusing on identifying and solidifying the underlying theory of change that we have, ideally, related to our strategies and our problems. Then in the next two webinars, we'll start to focus a little bit more on including data considerations to our strategies and how our data and our strategies align with the state. And then we will use all of this information to start to build logic models and start to put together a realistic plan for implementing our strategic planning process. So as we get started on this part two, I want to make sure that you have completed part one and that you have your key data points or your prioritized problems close at hand with you. And so we'll be utilizing those in this part to see how they align with your strategies. So we're focusing here first, and then we are going to need to have your strategies close at hand as well. So we are going to use those towards the end of this webinar. So you do need those, but specifically looking at those strategies that are implemented to address the data points that you identified in the first webinar. So if you don't have either one of those, I encourage you to stop this webinar, either go back and watch part one if you haven't done that, or pause this and go find those two pieces of information because we're going to need both of those. We're going to get started again with the data points. That's the one we're going to need first, and we won't need the strategies until much, much later. So as we think about this webinar, this part two, I want us to start by thinking about stories that you might read and also driving. So when we think about good stories, we'll start there. When we think about good stories or coherent stories, at least, we know that they should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? They logically flow together. So we have some sort of introduction, some sort of action and climax, and then we have some sort of a resolve at the end. I'm pretty sure that most of us would be incredibly frustrated if we were consistently reading books or stories that were just kind of that climax in the end with no introduction or intro piece, with no setup, no explanation, or if we just had an introduction and an ending and we missed all of the middle stuff, right? They're both unsatisfying and don't usually make sense. The same with driving somewhere. In this one, we need to think a little bit about the point. And it may not have a beginning, middle, end like a story does, but we do have a starting point and hopefully a route to get to our ending destination. And if I'm trying to get from St. Louis to Kansas City, and my goal is to be as fast and efficient as possible, I'm going to start in St. Louis. I'm going to drive on 70, that's my middle, to get to Kansas City. I could take some state highways and meander around, but that's not going to be the most efficient route. Now, if my goal was to start in St. Louis, drive to Kansas City, and to see all of northern Missouri, I'm going to take a very different route, right? So depending on what my goal is or what my point is, in that middle, that changes the way I would drive or the route I would drive. So when we think about our data and our strategies, I want us to still think of them in terms of stories and driving. So the data, our problem is going to be my starting destination or my beginning of my story. The strategies are going to work out and be the middle of my story or that path that I take while driving. And then my desired outcomes, what I want to see on my campus, that is my end or my end destination, the end of my story or my ending destination. So when we start to think about the strategies that you have and the data that you have, we're challenging you or encouraging you to think, does your strategy have a coherent story? Does it make sense where I'm starting and where I'm trying to get to? Is there a problem that we've identified, relevant actions that relate to it, and then a solution? Is there a clear beginning, middle, and end? Starting somewhere logical, steps that follow, getting me to my desired outcome. Or am I setting myself up for disappointment and my campus setting them up for disappointment with a little bit of a wonky either middle, beginning, and any of those three stages, those three phases? So when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about what is the theory of change for my strategies or for my campus. So a theory of change can be defined as a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. This is a theory of change is a semi-fancy word for just describing why we think the change that we are expecting to see should happen based off of what we're doing. So this theory of change examines these underlying assumptions that we have, especially as they might relate or should relate to the problems that we're addressing. So my first question to you to think about is whether or not your campus, for your strategies and your problems, does it have a theory of change? Do you have a strategy story that has a clear beginning, middle, and end? Does it start somewhere logical with the steps that follows to get you to that desired outcome? Or are we maybe missing a few stages? I will tell you that it is most likely that most of us are missing some sort of our theory of change. We're missing some sort of that, one of those pieces in our story. We would call this an implicit theory of change or an implied theory of change. Once we work through this process and as we finish up this webinar or you complete your homework after this webinar, you ideally will have an explicit theory of change. So right now, I would bet most of us have some sort of an implied theory or that implicit theory. And our goal at the end of this series, at least, is to have an explicit theory of change where you can see and identify each of those steps that we're expecting to happen and that logically connect to either side of them. And the best way to get to that point is to dive into both our data and our strategies, but first to check those implicit assumptions. So we can think of this, if you're familiar with the 5 whys approach to making decisions, that's very similar to what we're doing. So I told those of you who were at the December meeting, I read a book this past fall called Multipliers, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. But one of the challenges for leadership that it gave to the reader was what they called to take the extreme questions challenge. And so this is where, as a leader, you don't necessarily are making decisions, you're not making decisions, but rather asking questions of those that you lead or those that are around you to get more information from them or to ask questions that allows them to arrive at the answer themselves. So as opposed to you telling them what to do, you're asking them questions so that they can then decide what to do, sometimes with you leading them. So we're sort of like that in terms of asking a lot of questions. But with this theory of change and with this 5 why, we're asking the question that is talking about why is something happening. And then ideally, anytime we ask a why, we want to be able to verify it and back it up with data. So in this exercise and in this webinar, I don't expect you to have all of your data at hand that you can back all of these statements up. But you do want to make sure that after you ask yourself why, that you don't just go off of your gut or off of what you think, but that you're gathering some of that data to then make those data-driven decisions. So we can see here on the screen, this is an example from the business world. A printing company or like a brochure company ran into a problem where their client refused to pay for the leaflets that they printed for them. And as opposed to just getting mad and demanding payment, they went through the 5 whys. And so they said, why is our client refusing to pay for things that we did for them? And the answer came back that the delivery was late. And so then the leaflets couldn't be used. Well, why was the delivery late? Well, that's because the job took longer than they expected. Well, why did the job take longer, right? They're a printing company. They should do that. Well, they ran out of printer ink. That's obviously a problem. Why did they run out of ink? Apparently, the ink was used on a large last-minute order, and therefore there wasn't enough of it to be used on this one. Well, why was all their ink used? Apparently, they didn't have enough ink in stock, and they couldn't order new supplies in time. So for this problem, where their client is refusing to pay for leaflets that they printed for them, one of their solutions, one of their ways to avoid this in the future is to find an ink supplier who can deliver at short notice so that they can continue to keep low inventory, reduce waste, and still respond to customer demand. that countermeasure, that way to solve the problem that they had, is, at least for me, not my outright first thought of how to fix it, right? If I have somebody who's refusing to pay for leaflets that I printed, I might think about trying to invoice them earlier. I might think about not working with them anymore. I don't think I would have initially jumped to my ink supplier, right? But when we start to ask these questions, when we start to dive in and ask why is this happening, we start to see that there are a variety of different underlying measures or underlying influences that we should be focusing on or paying attention to, which also relates to you. So as we start to think about how this applies to our campuses, we need to start by identifying our problems, right? So you should have identified your prioritized problems in the first webinar. And so I want you to start to think about those and think about why. So why are your students binge drinking, if that's your problem? Why are students driving after drinking? Why are students reporting feeling suicidal or feeling so depressed and sad? And then once you think of a reason there, why is that the case? Why are they doing that? Why are my students binge drinking? Well, why? Maybe they're binge drinking because they're giving into peer pressure. Well, why are they doing that? And continue to ask yourself, why? Why? So here we're in this brainstorming session. We're thinking of reasons why they may be engaging in the problem, and then digging through that a bit, and taking that down the rabbit hole it may take us. And then once we get down to kind of that rabbit hole, we can start to think about why else might that happen. You are a math person at all, you might remember factor trees where you had to factor out numbers. We're thinking of building something like that. So we can take our prioritized problem and we can think about why. And we may come up with multiple different reasons why, right? And then for each of those possible reasons, we're going to ask why again. And we may come up with multiple whys for each of those, right? At some point, we're going to identify a possible root cause. We're going to identify those possible reasons or those underlying assumptions that are happening, or those underlying factors that are happening that are causing and working their way up to being related to that problem. It may happen on the first why, may happen on the second, could happen on the third. We would just keep going, right? So as you're brainstorming and asking yourself why these problems are happening, I encourage you to explore all possible avenues. It is a brainstorming session. We're going to just jot down everything we can come up with, and identify that some of them are going to work out and we'll be able to back up, but some of them maybe not as much. So here, I want to encourage you to pause this webinar, think about your prioritized problem, and start to build this factor tree here. Why is your problem occurring? Or why might your problem be occurring? And then track those pieces down until you get to a root cause or several root causes. So go ahead and pause here. And at this point, you should have something that maybe looks similar to this, or maybe a little bit different. But as you've wrapped up, or as you will wrap up your brainstorming, we then want to put on our data-driven lens, or our critical thinking lens, and think about what of these options, what of these possible whys or these root causes is a gut feeling versus something that's backed by data, either quantitative or qualitative data. What is an assumption versus what is something that I can verify? And think about what data could you look at to find to either support or refute your brainstormed reasons. We'll talk later about having this data to back up our assumptions, because as we are trying to build our theory of change, if we start to have our theory built on assumptions that we can't verify, we're going to start to get a weaker theory of change and have a wonky middle to our story, right? So we want to make sure that as we identify these whys, we start first by brainstorming. And brainstorming where there's not necessarily a wrong answer. Anything that we can think of works, at least at this first stage. Then you're going to take your factor tree and start to add data points to it, and make sure that your assumptions that you're making in this brainstorming have the data to back it up. And again, I don't expect you to have that data right now, so you'll utilize that as a homework or a task to tackle, or a challenge after this webinar wraps up. But for right now, I want you to look at your factor tree and think about, is there a path from your problem all the way down to your root cause that is the most backed by data, whether it is Mock-B data, campus conduct data, those types of things? Which one do you think would be easiest for you to get data to, again, either support or refute? And taking that path, we're going to try to build our first theory of change statement. So these, when I teach them to my college students, I challenge them to think of it as an if-then statement. If you can think way back when you were learning the scientific method and cause and effect, we can think of it that way. So if I change this risk protective contributing underlying factor, then I change the behavior. Or if I change this underlying factor, then I change the problem, right? So we're thinking of it in that way. So we can think about it as, if I reduce availability of alcohol, then I reduce the amount consumed. That's the whole premise that the college aim works off of for the environmental strategies. We can think about, if I correct the misperception that all students drink a 12-pack on a Thursday night, then more students will consume closer to the norm of 1 beer on Thursday. So we can see here we started to toss in some data where we're putting in some much more specifics than that first one. But we're thinking about, what if I address these things, if I change these things, then what's the behavior that's affected? So a third example, if I increase gender equality, then I reduce alcohol use on campus. Which most of you hopefully are looking at me and your screen a little bit wonky, because this is where we have run into our first challenge, right? So this one doesn't quite logically fit together. I at least don't know of any data that's going to back up an increase in gender equality that's going to change my alcohol use. Increase in gender equality may change other things, so maybe power-based violence, interpersonal violence, some of those things that might be affected by gender equality, but I don't know how treating my students equal based off of their gender identity is going to change my alcohol use. So this last one is an example of a weak theory of change, or an unsubstantiated theory of change. And so as you're thinking about this, sometimes you do need multiple if-then statements. Sometimes we need to think about each of those various why levels, or each of those possible factors that relate, and sometimes we'll have to build them up together. So we might have a series of if-then statements to get us from our root cause all the way up to our problem behavior, and that is perfectly fine. If that's something that we need to do to make the connection in the theory strong, then that's what we should do. So as we're thinking of these if-then statements, we should then start to think about, what might it be for yours, right? So do you have data? Again, the first question is, do you have data to support your statements, to support those whys or those possible root causes? If not, is it a data point that either you could have access to, or that maybe PIP staff could help you find, or identify where to find it? And then we want to start to make those connections in terms of, does my if-then statement make sense? Ideally, we'll be able to back this up with data, but for right now, look at your whys and your root causes and your problem statement. Is there a way that you can put those together to sum up the middle in order to justify where your root cause and how it relates to your problem statement? So here, go ahead and pause the webinar and start to think and draft a theory of change statement for your problem behavior, using, again, one of those why tangents or one of those y factor trees versus all of them together. Start at the top, work your way down following a path, and think about, can you sum up that path in an if-then statement? And as you get that theory of change outlined, look at that theory of change, that statement overall. Does that theory of change then align to a strategy you've identified? And again, ideally a strategy that you've got readily available that you can look. And it may not be that the path you followed aligns to one of the strategies you've brainstormed, but if you start to notice that all of your theory of change statements don't point to any of the strategies you've identified, you might have a possible misalignment, right? So if I'm focusing on norms misperception and I have this really great theory of change statement, but I don't have any strategies that actually directly relate to my theory of change, or I don't have any strategies that address any of those aspects in my theory of change, I might have a misalignment in the fact that the things that I want to change will not be addressed by the things that I'm doing. And so from here, as we start to build those theories of change, those statements, and looking at the possible routes that our strategies and our problem statements may take to get to each other, we're focusing on, at this stage, does it logically make sense? Ideally, from here, you will take your homework challenge and go find some data to match up with your whys. And again, focusing on those underlying factors that we know contribute to these problems based off of our data and off of our brainstorming. And this next webinar, the one part 3 that we'll have, we'll start to think about what does that data address and what does that data mean, and how does the data points possibly align or actually align with our strategies. And then how do all of those things, that our local data and our local strategies, how does that align to the state? And then we'll think about how we can take our theory of change and our data and our strategy alignment and put that together into a logic model, and then set up a planning framework for our strategic planning process that can then help us build a logical strategic plan. Thank you so much for being with us today and working through this. This is one of the shorter webinars that I think has a little bit more for you to do outside of the webinar. So if you need to come back and review this a couple of times before moving on, that's perfectly fine. You're going to want to make sure that you have a good theory of change and some data to back that up as you start to move forward. So you're going to start to get into the request of having more data as we keep going. And with that, thank you for being here.